In 2024, the Nigerian federal government spent more than every naira it earned just on servicing its debts. Debt servicing alone consumed 116% of federal revenue. This is according to the Nigerian Economic Summit Group. But the borrowing isn't slowing down. Under President Bola Ahmed Tinubu, Nigeria has added 72 trillion naira to its national debt in under 3 years. The question we have to answer here now is, where did all of that money actually go?
The country is going through a very strong phase of reform.
So here's what is happening right now. On April 23, 2026, Tinubu wrote to the Senate asking lawmakers to approve a $516 million loan from Deutsche Bank. The money is for sections of the Sokoto to Badagry superhighway, a 1,000-kilometer road that would link Nigeria's northwest to the port city of Lagos. But this wasn't a one-off. It was his latest in a continuous sequence. Just 3 weeks earlier, on April 1st, the National Assembly approved a $6 billion package, $5 billion from First Abu Dhabi Bank in the UAE and $1 billion from UK Export Finance through Citibank in London for port rehabilitation. That is $6.5 billion in new external borrowing commitments. This looks alarming seeing the trajectory Nigeria is on. The opposition has called this relentless borrowing reckless. But the real question isn't just how much has Tinubu borrowed. It is what the country actually has to show for it. And to answer that, we have to go back. First, context. How did Nigeria get here? Let's start with something called ways and means. It is the overdraft facility the central bank is legally allowed to extend to the federal government, capped by the CBN Act at 5% of the previous year's revenue. But under former President Muhammadu Buhari, that cap was blown apart. By 2022, Ways and Means stood at 138% of the previous year's revenue. The facility grew from 856 billion naira at the start of its term to 23.8 trillion naira by the end, a 2,635% increase. In May 2023, that is in Buhari's final days in office, the Senate approved converting 22.7 trillion naira of that into a 40-year bond at 9% interest. In December of the same year, Tinubu secured approval for another 7.3 trillion naira, which means 30 trillion naira that used to be short-term overdrafts is now long-term debt on Nigeria's books until 2063. That is the single biggest reason the numbers look so much larger under Tinubu, but most of that money wasn't actually borrowed under him. Then came two shocks on day one. On May 29, 2023, at his inauguration, Tinubu said subsidy is gone. Petrol prices tripled within weeks. 2 weeks later, on June 14th, the central bank abandoned the managed exchange rate and the naira floated. It went from about 460 naira to the dollar to over 1,000 naira by September and above 1,600 naira at moments in 2024. Dollar-denominated debt didn't grow, but in naira terms, it exploded. That is the second reason the debt figure looks so much larger. Pure exchange rate math. And thirdly, the revenue problem. Between January and July of 2025, federal revenue came in at 13.67 trillion naira, a 42.7% shortfall against target. In those same 7 months, debt servicing and federal salaries together consumed 105% of that revenue, which means every naira spent on roads, hospitals, schools, or soldiers in those months came from a loan. And then we have the fourth one, the servicing trap. The more Nigeria borrows, the more it pays in interest, and the more of its revenue disappears before it funds anything tangible. Of the $2.93 billion Nigeria spent servicing Euro bonds between mid-2023 and mid-2025, 83% went to paying interest alone. Only 17% actually reduced the debt. This is like taking a new OPay loan to pay back your PalmPay loan. And that brings us to 2026 and the question of what $1 billion at a time is actually funding. In the last 3 years, Nigeria hasn't just been borrowing, it's been borrowing fast and from a rotating cast of creditors. $2.2 billion in Euro bonds in December 2024, another $2.35 billion in November 2025, around $9 billion in World Bank loans across 17 approvals, a $1 billion African Development Bank budget support program, a $1.87 billion financing package for the Lagos-Calabar Coastal Highway, and now $6 billion from the UAE and UK approved in a single parliamentary session in April. Total identifiable new external borrowing commitments since May 2023 is roughly $20 billion. But here's what almost no one is asking. When you take each of those loans and sort them, not by creditor, not by headline size, but by what the money is actually for, they fall into three very different buckets. Bucket A is productive assets, loans tied to things you can actually see and use. And under bucket A, we have the Lagos-Calabar Coastal Highway financing. We have port rehabilitation, power sector recovery, World Bank education, and health programs. That's roughly $8 to $9 billion of new identifiable external borrowing. And then we have bucket B, budget support. Under this category, we have loans that don't build anything. They cover the government's running costs. Salaries, overhead, grants, deficit financing, and this is where they buy their cars and yachts and presidential jets from. We have the $1.5 billion World Bank Research Program, the $750 million Armor Revenue Reforms Loans, the $2.2 billion December 2024 Eurobond, and this month, the single largest facility in the entire sequence, a $5 billion total return swap with First Abu Dhabi Bank, which Tinubu's own letter to the Senate described as being for budget implementation and repayment of relatively expensive domestic and external debt. That is roughly $11 to $12 billion. And then we have bucket C, refinancing. Loans whose purpose is to pay off other loans. We have $1.1 billion of the November 2025 Eurobond, which was used to refinance a 2018 Eurobond that matured the same month. A portion of the $5 billion in FAB facility does the same. So add it all up. About 35 to 40% of new external borrowing under Tinubu is going into productive assets. And then we have more than 50 to 55% which is going into budget support. Put another way, for every dollar Nigeria has borrowed abroad under this administration, roughly 60 cents has gone to the government's running costs or to pay off old loans. 40 cents has gone to building something new. Now, the administration strongly disagrees with that framing. So, let's give them the floor. The Tinubu administration makes three arguments. First, that the headline number is misleading. They say the 72 trillion naira nominal increase is, in their own words, largely mathematical. In dollar terms, Nigeria's public debt went from about $113 billion at handover to $111 billion today, roughly flat. Much of the increase is just the devaluation of the naira, plus the former accounting of that 30 trillion naira in ways and means inherited from the Buhari government. And second, they also said that the reforms are working. I think I need to clarify here that this is the government's standpoint. It does not reflect what I think on the topic. Alright, let's get back to the video. The government says inflation has fallen from 24.23% in March 2025 to 14.45%. GDP grew 3.98% in the third quarter of 2025. External reserves hit $50 billion in February 2026, a 7-year high. And investor confidence, they say, is strong. The November 2025 Eurobond was oversubscribed more than 4 times over, with a $13 billion order book. And then thirdly, they say infrastructure is being delivered. In December 2025, the government said it had opened a 47-kilometer stretch of the Lagos-Calabar Coastal Highway. In his December 2025 budget speech, Tinubu said, quote,
"We will continue to reduce waste, strengthen controls, and ensure that every Nigerian borrowed or spent delivers measurable public value."
But serious economists say the composition tells a different story. First point, the servicing burden is crushing. Forget what they say debt to GDP ratios. Forget all the grammars. Now look at what it actually costs to service the debt against what the country earns. The Nigerian Economic Summit Group, a non-partisan research body, says Debt servicing alone consumed 116.8% of federal revenue in 2024. Not debt plus salaries, just the interest and principal payments on existing debt against every naira the government collected. Secondly, the new loans are not fixing that problem. They are feeding it. Of every dollar Nigeria spent servicing euro bonds from 2023 to 2025, 83 cents went to interest. Only 17 cents reduced the actual debt, which means the debt is still growing. If there were anything like a debt policy scheme, I think that is what we're running right now. Borrowing from Mr. A to pay debt owed to Mr. B. Then thirdly, the composition itself. Of the $6 billion approved this April, $5 billion is explicitly for budget implementation and debt refinancing. Only $1 billion goes to a productive asset. That is not a misreading by critics. That is how the administration described it in its own letter to Parliament. This is a crisis waiting to happen. So, what does the evidence actually show? Well, the evidence doesn't settle the question of whether Tinubu is borrowing too much. We all know he is. It settles a different question: where the money is going. And that picture doesn't match either side's clean narrative, which matters because it is your money that pays the bill. Nigeria's 2026 budget, which Tinubu signed into law on April 17th, spends 68.32 trillion naira. Debt servicing alone is 15.8 trillion naira. That is more than defense and security at 5.41 trillion naira. Infrastructure at 3.56 trillion naira, education at 3.52 trillion, and health at 2.48 trillion naira. Combined, those four line items together come to 14.97 trillion. Only debt beat them all. For every 1 naira the government spends on health in 2026, it is spending 6.4 naira on debt interest. For every 1 naira it spends on education, 4.5 more goes to debt. Health as a share of the 2026 budget is about 3.6%, less than a quarter of what Nigeria committed to 25 years ago under the 2001 Abuja Declaration, which pledged 15% of every African government's budget to health. Now, divide the 159 trillion naira debt by Nigeria's population, and every citizen, that is all of you watching this video from newborn to elder, carries about 724,000 naira of it on your shoulders. But here's a deeper question most coverage isn't asking. Who does Nigeria actually owe this money to? As of September 2025, the World Bank's International Development Association, the IDA, held $18.7 billion of Nigerian debt. That makes Nigeria the third largest IDA borrower in the world, behind only Bangladesh and Pakistan. Larger than Ethiopia, larger than Kenya, larger than Ghana. Euro bonds held by global investors in London, New York, Dubai, Zurich account for another $17 billion. China's Exim Bank holds $4.9 billion, though new Chinese lending has slowed sharply under Tinubu. Yeah, we understand why. And then there is the newest creditor on the list, the United Arab Emirates. The $5 billion total return swap approved on April 1st is the single largest identifiable UAE exposure to Nigeria ever signed. The UAE is also a major lender on the Lagos-Calabar Highway. But what is a total return swap? I've been using that term a lot. So let me define it for you. It's a derivative contract. Nigeria pledges naira-denominated bonds worth 133% of the cash it receives in dollars. If the naira falls or Nigerian bond prices drop, Nigeria has to put up more collateral, and some of that has to be paid in dollars. Angola signed a similar deal with JP Morgan in December 2024, and within 4 months, US tariff turmoil pushed oil prices down and Angolan bond values with them, triggering a $200 million margin call that Luanda had to meet. Yeah, so many grammars. I wish there were simpler terms. Okay, the Tinubu administration sent the $5 billion request to Parliament on March 31st. This loan was approved within 3 hours without committee hearings, and the full contractual terms have never been made public. Now, I want to make this clear. That move isn't illegal, but debt transparency specialists have been warning that these kinds of structures create what they call invisible debt layers. Debt that doesn't show up on official balance sheets until something goes wrong. So, what's next? While the headlines focus on how much Tinubu has borrowed, the real story is what the borrowing is buying and who is holding the paper when it all comes due. The government says the reforms are working, but the opposition says the country is drowning. Both are reading the same numbers. But what the numbers actually show is this: Nigeria is spending more on interest than on defending itself, educating its children, and keeping its people healthy combined. More than half of new external borrowing isn't building anything new. And the newest creditor to join the list got its $5 billion facility approved in a single day, with the terms still private. That is the context I want you to take away. The rest is yours to decide. And before I go, in the next video, I'm surely going to look at all the things this administration has bought for itself. Let's see how that compares to the investment in education, health, and security.